All right, good evening. So welcome back. This is class number 2 of the Hidden Miracle series, studying Megillas Esther. And I want to begin by going back to the end of the last chapter. We actually left one verse over that we didn't discuss yet, the final verse. But even before we do that, I just want to review or come back to some points that I think I maybe rushed through at the end, but I think are very important that we highlight and bring out. So I actually put back on the source sheet from chapter 1, the final 2 verses. And we learned last week that there was a process by which Achashverosh, the king, the Persian king, was granted great power at this time. That we learned, according to the Malbim, that was actually his goal of the whole party, but it finally came to fruition at the end, where his advisor Memuchan, which according to our sages was actually Haman, advised him to, first of all, make an enactment that would give him full power, and the officials present would sign on to that. And not only that, but he advised him to get rid of Vashti. Now it's very fascinating because just moments before, Achashverosh was doing all that he could to try to save Vashti. As soon as Vashti got in trouble, we learned that Achashverosh was actually advocating for her. He was trying to save her, trying to bring about that she should not have to be deposed, not have to be killed, that nothing should happen to her. And then all of a sudden, there's like an about face. Memuchan advises him, you should get rid of Vashti, and it says in the verse, the matter pleased the king and the princes and everyone present, and they all signed off on it. So this is something that we have to note, that this is all part of the miracle, part of God pulling the strings, was this about face that Achashverosh had where, okay, fine, good idea. Let's get rid of Vashti. And that's what happens. So that's one thing that I think we have to take note of. And the second thing is that, as I just mentioned, there was some amount of power being transferred over to Achashverosh. The way that we presented it was primarily based on the Malbim, who understood that Achashverosh was being granted absolute power at this point, absolute control. He could make his own laws. He could do what he wants. Others explain it slightly differently. For example, the Vilna Gaon says that actually he wasn't being given all power, but he was being granted the power to rule in cases and situations, even when they were relevant to himself. Prior to this, if it was something that he might have a bias in, he would have to step aside and leave that ruling up to his officials. And here he was being granted the power even to rule in cases which were relevant to himself, which would later end up being very important when it was time for Haman to go, that he'd be able to just make the call that Haman should be killed. But whichever way we understand that there's a certain amount of power being handed over to Achashverosh, which is going to be very important as the story continues. And even that, it's like you have all these officials sitting there and they just take out their pens and they sign it away. They sign away their own power and they say, okay, yeah, we are going to hand you absolute control. And again, this is going to be very important in the end. And this is another miraculous event that would go unnoticed if we weren't paying close attention. So just wanted to bring out those 2 important points. And now let's look at the final verse of chapter 1. It says there, verse 22, and he sent letters to all the king's provinces. So the king sends out letters to every province according to its script. So the different provinces had different languages that they spoke and different scripts. And to every nationality according to its language. So the letters were in all languages, so everybody could understand them. And what was in this letter? That every man dominate in his household and speak according to the language of his nationality. So as we saw last week, there was this concern that people will think that since Vashti refused Achashverosh, that maybe a woman should have some degree of power in her home. And this was something that the advisors of Achashverosh, said, we can't have that. We can't have that in our kingdom. And if people hear what Vashti did, it's going to be terrible. And Achashverosh actually sends out a letter, a command that each man should dominate. The man should be in charge of the house. He should be the man of the house, and they should speak the language of his nationality, which doesn't seem so significant, so important, but that's, if you have a mixed marriage, two different languages, you follow the language of the husband is in charge. That was the letter, the edict that Achashverosh had sent out at that time. Now the Talmud has a fascinating comment over here. The Talmud, which is in source number 2, it says that if you look at the second line there, it says, Rava said, in the underlined, were it not for the first letter sent by Achashverosh, there would not have been left among the enemies of the Jewish people, which really means the Jewish people. It's just, we don't want to say that. There would have been nothing left of the Jewish people, a remnant or a refugee. If not for these first letters, there would be nothing left of the Jews. In other words, the Talmud is saying that these letters that he sent out, that every man should dominate in his home, were themselves part of the miracle. If not for these letters, there would be nothing left of the Jewish people. And then the Talmud explains why. It says, and really actually Rashi in his commentary helps us out. Rashi says it's also there, for they would have hurried to kill the Jews at the command of the king when the next letters were sent, and would not have waited until the designated date. Let's understand that in a moment. If you continue on the next line, it says that they who received them would say, meaning they received these letters, and they would say, what is this that he has sent us? That every man shall wield authority in his own house? This is obvious. Even a lowly weaver is commander in his house. So they got these letters, and they just seemed ridiculous to them. They said, all the people throughout the provinces, they said, oh, the man is always ruling in the house. And so these letters there's something weird about this king. There's something a little bit off about him. Now, why was that important? What was important was that later, it's going to be a few years before it happens, but sometime later, which seems to be the next time he sent an edict all around to all his provinces, was the command that they would, on a designated date, the 13th of Adar, wipe out the Jewish people. So the people got this letter. Now, there were plenty of people that had no liking and great hate for the Jewish people. And they, seeing the opportunity, they would have jumped at it, not waited until the designated date. They was like, oh, he wants us to wipe them out. Let's go. Let's do it right now. Why are we waiting? But because he had sent this first letter, they didn't know if they should take him seriously. And so they delayed. That's how Rashi interprets it. That's what the Talmud seems to be saying here. If not for those letters, which made people think that this king is crazy, should we really take his letters seriously? Then there would be nothing left of the Jewish people. They would have rushed to wipe them out as soon as they got the letters. That's what the Talmud says. Now we're going to mention actually 3 other explanations for why these letters were so pivotal in the story. So the first is that the Malbim, again, building off of his whole approach that there was absolute power being handed over to Achashverosh, these letters or the letters that had previously been signed, somewhere over here we have this key moment going on. This is all part of this Achashverosh being handed over absolute power. And he understands that that's what, if we take a step back, the Talmud says Rava said. It's like if we're not for the first letters, there would not have been left among the enemies of the Jewish people. Then the Talmud goes on to explain why. But commentaries offer other reasons. What was so important about the letters? So besides for the Talmud's own explanation, that it was because they thought he was crazy, another explanation is that because these letters were, to some extent, the first exercising of his absolute power. And if not for that absolute power, there will be nothing left of the Jewish people. That's how the Malbim understands what's going on here. That's, if not for this absolute power that was granted to him, well, later on, after he has signed away, with his advisors, with Haman, he signs away the lives of the Jewish people. So later he wants to rescind that. He doesn't rescind it. He will learn about exactly what he does, but the way that they are able to maneuver and change things later on is only because of the power that was granted to him at this point. And so that's how the Malbim interprets this. If not for the power that was granted to him at this point, there would be nothing left, no remnant left of the Jewish people. Now, a third approach to why these letters were so important actually focuses more on the second part of the letter, which has to do with everyone speaking their own language, which seems just random, right? What's that doing there? So there's one thing that we didn't really discuss last week, which is probably surprising maybe to some that we didn't discuss it, because it's something that we probably are mostly familiar with, which is, we had Achashverosh throws this big party. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about at all last week was how the Jewish people attended that party, which when we think about this party, that's one of the things I think that most people think about. What we saw last week is it actually doesn't mention that anywhere in the Megillah explicitly that the Jews attended the party of Achashverosh. That is part of our Midrashic and Talmudic tradition, that was an important aspect of it. When something terrible befalls the Jewish people, or nearly befalls the Jewish people, we have to do some, we have to contemplate and look internally, examine what maybe led to these events, because we believe that no events are random, and these types of things happen as a result of our actions. And sometimes we don't know, and sometimes we have a tradition that tells us what it was or what it could have been. So the Talmud, the Midrash, both point to the feast of Achashverosh. The reason why the Jewish people possibly could have suffered greatly or been wiped out was because they attended the feast of Achashverosh. So putting aside, is that, the question, is that like, how does the punishment match the sin? But this was sinful. There were certainly, like we say, it wasn't a place for a Jewish boy or a Jewish girl to be at that party, probably for many reasons. And the question then is, why did the Jewish people still attend? What was it that drew them there? So Rabbi Yosef Salat, who was a rabbi in Jerusalem in the 50s, beautiful work he has called Be'er Yosef, he suggests that the Jewish people understood that it wasn't ideal for them to be at this party, but they felt that if they don't attend, people are going to say, everybody's here except the Jews. There they go again, trying to be different, not going along with what everybody else is doing. And the truth is, though, that and therefore they felt they need to attend. Otherwise, it's not going to look good. Now, at the end of the day, if it's somewhere where they shouldn't be, then they shouldn't be there, even if it doesn't look good. But more than that, we're not supposed to be the same as everybody else. We're supposed to have a unique identity and not just go along with everything that everybody else is doing. We have our own Torah. We have our tradition that we are supposed to keep to. And God says, I will separate you from the other nations. And sometimes if we get too close and we make ourselves too similar, God says, if you're not going to separate yourself, then I will separate yourself. So a clear separation is made where the Jewish people are singled out. And this has happened throughout our history. And this is what is going on in this story. Here they attend because we have to go along with what everybody else is doing. We can't look different. But it's not always the right and often not the right call. We don't do things just because everybody else is doing it. We do what's right. We do what we're supposed to do. And so there was a certain claim against the Jewish people at this time by God that you made yourself too similar to the nations of the world. Now, we find a similar thing in Egypt, actually. There's Midrash, our sages teach us again the same thing, that as the slavery was arriving, which they knew, they had a prophecy. God told Abraham they would be slaves in a foreign land. Also, they tried to make themselves similar in certain ways to the Egyptians. However, the Midrash teaches us that there were a few things that they kept separate, and that was a merit for them for redemption. So the Midrash says they didn't change their names, they didn't change their language, and they didn't intermarry. Now, in the current Persia, in the current exile there that we're discussing, if you look in the book of Ezra, which also is from the same time period, so it's clear that there was plenty of intermarriage going on. It's also clear that they kept their Jewish names. So on the one hand, they kept their Jewish names. On the other hand, they were intermarrying. So they didn't have all of these things going for them like they did in Egypt. What about their language? Did they keep their language? So along come a number of commentaries, and they say that Achashverosh actually helped them out in this regard. Achashverosh helped them out because in this edict, it said in this verse, right, that everybody should speak according to the language of his nationality, meaning not specifically the husband, but in each province, there wouldn't be like a melting pot, one language. Everybody could speak their own language. And so the Jewish people were able to maintain their own language as a result of Achashverosh's edict. So this turns around and actually becomes to their benefit. It's a merit for them because it helps them keep their identity. Here they are in exile. There's risk of assimilation. They're becoming very similar to the Gentiles around them. And Achashverosh gives them a little assistance in helping preserve their Jewish identity when he says everybody could and should keep their own language. So they may have been intermarrying, but on the other hand, at least they kept their names, their Jewish names, and they kept their language. And they got 2 out of 3. That was a merit for them. And perhaps that was a pivotal part of meriting the salvation that they eventually merit. So that's another way to understand, if not for these original letters, there would be nothing left of the Jewish people, because if not for these letters, then they would have assimilated even more and not had the merit to be saved. Okay. We're going to offer one more explanation of that line, of that idea that of why these letters were pivotal, but we'll wait a little bit until we get into the next chapter before we do that. So we're ready for chapter 2, and chapter 2 begins after these events. Achar hadivarim ha'ela. When King Achashverosh's fury subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed upon her. So after these events, how long after? How long did it take for the king's fury to subside? So it's debated, of course, because it doesn't say explicitly. But Rabbi Shlomo Al-Kabetz, great 16th century, 17th century Kabbalist, in his commentary, the Megillah, he explains, I guess 16th century probably, he thinks that it was a while after, because we know that Achashverosh made his party in the 3rd year of his reign. And we also know that it wasn't until the 7th year of his reign that Esther became queen. So, and this is going to be the beginning of the search for a queen. So there's 4 years between when she becomes queen and when Vashti is killed. So this is sometime in between that, but you can deduce it's at least 2 years later. So there's a while after. It takes a while for Achashverosh's fury to subside. And the verse says that he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed upon her. Meaning that he remembered that they had decreed that she should be killed. and also that he would then need to look for a new queen. Remember, that was the recommendation of Memuchan, was get rid of Vashti and find yourself a queen that's better than her. So he had accomplished the first task, but now he realized it's time to accomplish the second task and find himself a queen. And he mentions this to his servants. And then it says in verse 2, and the king's young men, his servants, said, let them seek for the king young maidens of comely, beautiful appearance, and let the king appoint commissioners to all the provinces of his kingdom. Let them gather every young maiden of beautiful appearance to Shushan, the capital, to the house of the women, to the custody of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, and let their ointments be given to them. So these young servants hatch a plan for Achashverosh to help him find his next queen. So again, different ways to understand. Of course, as I mentioned, there's so many different commentaries, but one way to understand this in the commentary of Yosef Lekach was that their plan was as follows. First of all, they said we should find young maidens of beautiful appearance. Now, that seems kind of obvious, right? Of course, the king is going to want someone who's beautiful. So what were they saying, as opposed to someone who's not beautiful? No, that's not what they were saying. They were saying someone who's beautiful, as opposed to focusing on other traits or other factors, such as lineage. You don't need someone who's from royalty. That's not important. In fact, that was trouble for you last time around. The reason why Vashti was willing to stand up to you was because she felt she was from royal blood, and that made her more arrogant, and she stood up to you. So for your new queen, you don't need someone of royal blood. Just find someone beautiful, and that's it. That's all you need. And their plan was, now you can't just bring thousands and thousands of beautiful women to Shushan. The king is going to spend the rest of his life trying to find a wife. So the plan was, as the verse says, appoint commissioners to all the provinces, let them gather every young maiden of beautiful appearance, and then they would, from the ones that they originally gathered, they would each choose the most beautiful from each province. So in the Hebrew, it first says, in verse 2, it says, let them seek out for the king young maidens in the plural. And then in verse 3, it says, every maiden, instead of, in the Hebrew, it could have been in the plural again, but it's not. In the Hebrew, it could have been na'arot both times, but it's not. So there's this change that goes on between the first verse and the second verse, verse 2 and verse 3. And Yosef Lekach explains that that's bringing out this idea that originally what they would do was they would gather all the maidens in each of the provinces, all of the most beautiful women, and these commissioners, these people assigned to each province would be in charge of finding the most beautiful from that province, and then they would bring that one girl to the palace, so that we learned last week there were 127 provinces. So altogether there would be 127 girls from which the king would select his new wife. But really the pool is much larger at the beginning, and they would narrow it down, and then he would select from 127. I think others understand differently. There were many, many more than that brought to Shushan, but that's how Yosef Lekach explains it. And one other point here is that they wanted to appoint new commissioners to the provinces. The commentaries explain that they needed new commissioners, meaning new people in charge. Somebody who's been around a while, so he's more comfortable, he has relationships with people, they could bribe him, he may, Achashverosh won't necessarily get everyone that he wants to get. But if you appoint new new commissioners, new people in charge. So then they weren't willing to accept bribes. Nobody would be able to hide their daughters, just slip a few dollars to the commissioner. No, this way, everybody all of the beautiful girls would be found, and they would choose from all of them. But you get the sense here that the commentaries say that there was maybe some hesitance. Not everybody wanted their daughter to be taken to Shushan to be the queen. They remembered what happened to the previous queen. But besides for that, the chances of your daughter being selected was pretty slim, right? They're choosing from thousands and thousands of women, and chances are she would be sent home embarrassed and no longer a virgin, as we'll see, and that would not be something that people wanted. So they might try to avoid this draft, and in order to make sure that didn't happen, so they appointed new commissioners that wouldn't accept bribes. Okay, verse number 4. So they then advise, and let the maiden who pleases the king reign instead of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did so. So here is a very important point in this verse, which is, who's going to make this decision? Who's going to be the next queen? Only one person, the king, on his own, without input from others. Let the maiden who pleases the king, that's whoever pleases the king, that's who's going to reign instead of Vashti. Nobody else is going to have a say. Nobody else needs to have a say. Again, this is all part of the power that's been conferred upon Achashverosh. Something this important, if we were dealing with something more of a constitutional monarchy, then some of the advisors may, want to have a say, or the officials or the government, they might get involved and say, well, you can't take her. She's just it's not going to work out. It's not going to be good for our relationships with other places, all sorts of things that could be calculated, but they left it completely up to the king. And that, of course, was pivotal in him being able to just select Esther when it's Esther's turn. So that's the plan. And now the Megillah introduces us to Mordechai and Esther. So verse 5, it says, there was a Judean man in Shushan the capital. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan abira. There was a Yehudi, a Jew, in Shushan the capital, whose name was Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. The commentaries point out here that typically you might see in the Hebrew, instead of saying Ish Yehudi haya, there was a man, it would say Vayehi Ish. But many verses start Vayehi, and there was. The Megillah starts Vayehi, and there was. The idea here of switching around a little bit, it's hard to bring out in the English, but is that the Megillah is stressing there was already a man in Shushan whose name was Mordechai. We mentioned last week from the Vilna Gaon that many different commentaries in different ways, but Achashverosh moved the capital to Shushan. Whether it was because his throne happened to be there, or whether it was just to show off his power, to show that he can do things his own way, but he moved the capital of the empire to Shushan. This verse is telling us the real reason why he moved to Shushan. There was already a Jewish man named Mordechai living there. And that Jewish man, Mordechai, is going to be a catalyst in the salvation of the Jewish people here. And God was positioning everything for the salvation. And therefore, God brought Achashverosh to Mordechai. God brought Achashverosh to Shushan, and that's what it's bringing out here. There was already a Jewish man in Shushan whose name was Mordechai, and at the time that Achashverosh moved to Shushan. And it describes who he was. It says he had been exiled from Jerusalem with the exile that was exiled with Yechoniah, king of Judah, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. There were different stages to the exile. And one of those stages was when Yechaniah was exiled, and along with him was Mordechai. We'll talk about that again in a moment. Verse 7, and he had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maiden was of comely form and of comely appearance. Again, she was beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordechai took her to himself for a daughter. So Esther is his niece, actually his cousin, his uncle's daughter. She is his first cousin, and she didn't have a father or mother. Her parents died, and he took her in and raised her like a daughter. Just talk about Esther's name for a second here. It says he had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. So what was her name? Was her name Esther or was her name Hadassah? So there's different opinions in the Talmud whether her real name was Hadassah and they called her Esther, or her real name was Esther and they called her Hadassah. The most simple approach is one of the opinions in the Talmud. Rabbi Nehemiah concurs and says Hadassah was her real name. Why then was she called Esther? This was her non-Hebrew name, for owing to her beauty, the nations of the world called her after Istahar, which is Venus. So, but what it means is that she had a Persian name, Esther. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, and her Persian name was Esther. Some commentaries suggest that actually Mordechai changed her name at this juncture when she's about to be taken to the palace. So he tells her, in the palace, don't go by the name Hadassah anymore. That will be obvious that you're Jewish. Go by the name Esther, and which is a Persian name, and that will cover up for you. And we'll talk about why he wanted to cover that up. But that's one of the approaches to her name. Her real name was Hadassah, her Hebrew name, and when she was taken to the palace, she went by Esther, which was a Persian name. Now, the Malbim understands that these verses are trying to bring out the degree of difficulty that it would have been for Mordechai to hide Esther, and to show that despite that, he tried, and they tried as hard as they could to keep Esther from being selected. Esther was beautiful, and they understood that she could possibly be selected, and they did all that they could to make sure, or to try to make sure, that she does not get selected and brought to the king's palace. And again, this is important to understand, again, the level of the miracle. They were doing everything that they could that she not be selected, and yet she somehow still ends up being chosen. So the Malbim walks us through these verses 5, 6, and 7. He says, first of all, it says, there was an Ish Yehudi, a Judean man. So and he had already lived in Shushan. Now, if he lived further away, so he could have claimed when the guards would come, again, we're trying to show actually the risk that he was undertaking by trying to hide her. The law was you had to hand over your beautiful daughters, bring them out. And he was trying to hide her. So there was a great risk in doing this because he didn't really have any excuse. He lived in Shushan, which was the capital. Everybody knew about the edict. If he lived far away, so maybe he could have claimed, I didn't know, I didn't hear about it, the letter never reached me. In Shushan, that was no excuse. So number one, he was in Shushan. Number two, his name was Mordechai. He was a prominent figure. He was one of the leaders of the Jewish people. He was prominent. Otherwise, he might have been able to argue that, I didn't bring her out because I thought, who am I? We're nothings. Nobody's interested in us. But he was a prominent person. So that wasn't a good excuse. In fact, he was a descendant of King Saul, as was Esther. So they actually came from royal lineage. So they had certain prominence. And so he couldn't have made the excuse, I didn't think that anybody would be interested in me. he was a refugee. He originally was exiled. He was part of the exile from Jerusalem. So again, that he had to show appreciation if he was a long time citizen. So then it wasn't as much risk to him if he didn't go along with the law. Okay, they may have punished him a little bit, but not so bad. But if he was a refugee, and they're giving him safe haven here, and still he breaks the law, so that's very risky for him. And yet he still tried to hide her. Furthermore, he was in exile with Yechaniah. Now, who was exiled with Yechaniah? The leaders, the prominent people. With King Yechaniah, again showing his prominence. Even though he was in exile, he couldn't say, "Oh, therefore, again, like, who would want us? We're not important. We're not prominent." But he was part of part of those who were exiled because of their prominence, because of their positions. So he really had little to no excuse if he would get caught trying to hide Esther. And it says he had brought up Esther. So, and that was known. And he was related to her, and she didn't have a father. He was completely in charge of her, and he couldn't have excused himself and said, well, she doesn't listen to me. I was telling her to come out and she wouldn't listen. No. So all of this that he's hiding her with really no excuse for it is putting himself at great risk, and her. But they did it anyways. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is a fourth approach to understand why those original letters were so important. Those letters saying that a man should rule in his household. So let's just read verse 8 and then we'll come back to that. So verse 8, it says, "And it came to pass when the king's order and his decree were heard, and when many maidens were gathered to Shushan the capital, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women." So the Vilna Gaon explains this verse that it came to pass that the king's order and his decree were heard. There seemed to be two different things here. There were two different stages. There was the original order, and for that time, Mordechai was able to hide Esther. But then they got even stricter, and then they said if whoever's hiding a beautiful maiden will be put to death. That was the decree. And yet he still tried to hide her. They still tried to hide her, and but she was found. And they brought her to the custody of Haggai. They brought her to the palace. Now, the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, quotes from his teacher, Rabbi Pinchas Horowitz, that another explanation for why those letters were so pivotal. That was if not for those letters that said that the man is in charge of the house, it's possible that Esther would have actually succeeded in hiding and never would have been found. Why? He says because what did those letters say? They said that the man should be in charge of the house. Now, if there was no law to that effect, then they would be able to hide her. They would say that the guards would come. They'd say, "Oh, we heard there's a beautiful girl here." And Mordechai would say, "Well, she went out shopping. I'm sorry, she's not here." Right? And they'd say, "Oh, okay, like let us know when she gets back." Right? And then each time they would come, he'd say, "I tried to keep her here for you and she just won't listen to me." But he says, but since the law was that the man is in control of the house, so therefore he couldn't make such an excuse. She had to listen to him by law. And therefore they were unable to scheme in this way that she should be able to avoid the guards. And therefore, eventually she was found. And of course, it's very important that she was eventually found because she is needed to become the queen. So that's another explanation for, if not for those original letters, then there would be no one left of the Jews, because if not for those letters granting the man full power in the house, then Esther would have been able to be out of the house without, and Mordechai would throw up his hand and say, well, I have no control over her. I tried to convince her to stay, but because the order was that the man is in charge, so then he would not be able to make such an excuse. Okay, cute idea. So they bring Esther to the palace. Now, as I mentioned, there was great risk that both Mordechai and Esther undertook in trying to hide her, but they were found. So what's going to happen to them? Seemingly, they should be punished for trying to avoid the king's orders. That was if you don't listen to the king, you get killed. You get the death penalty. But that's not what happens, and it's quite miraculous. So it says in verse 9, and the maiden pleased him. So she's brought to Haggai. Haggai's in charge of all the girls to get them ready to see the king. And the maiden pleased him, and she won his favor. So instead of her being punished, instead of Mordechai being punished, it kind of all fades away. They forget about it. They like her so much, and they miraculously, despite their efforts to hide her, they get away with it, and nothing happens to them. The maiden pleased her, she won his favor, and not only that, but he hastened her ointments and her portions to give them to her. He gave her extra service. He didn't take his time. He put her first. He gave her 7 maidens fitting to give her from the king's house. That usually the queen was given 7 maidens. He's already conferring on her almost the title of queen. He's giving her 7 maidens. He changed her and her maidens to the best portions in the house of the women. He's favoring her. He really likes her. She has won his favor, the favor of Haggai. Maybe some understand already Achashverosh has his eye on her, and that's where this is all coming from. But either way, she's immediately taken in and loved and favored, and all that risk that they undertook, at least for now, they are safe from. Now we come to verse 10, which is the famous idea, but difficult to understand. Esther did not reveal her nationality or her lineage, for Mordechai had ordered her not to reveal it. And every day Mordechai would walk about in front of the court of the house of the women to learn of Esther's welfare and what would be done to her. So he stays around to check on her. But he tells her not to reveal her nationality or her lineage. And the question is, why? We know this, right? We know she never revealed her. Mordechai tells her, don't reveal who you are. But why? Why did he tell her that? So there's actually a few different possible explanations offered. One is, very simply, if she won't tell them who she is, well, let's go the other way. If she would tell them who she is, what her nationality is, what her lineage is, they'll say, oh, wow, you're of royal lineage. You come from King Shaul. Wow, that's, you are fit to be the queen. Again, not necessarily knowing maybe that they are not looking for that even, but that's one, they don't want to be chosen. They don't want Esther to be chosen. So they don't want to let on that she comes from a royal family. Again, they're doing all that they can to avoid her being selected. Another possibility, like we just learned, they put themselves at great risk to hide her, and then she was found. But they don't necessarily remember, the guards and everything, exactly where she came from, who her people are. It could be that if they would have found out at this time, at this moment when they brought her, if she would have told who she was, they was like, okay, now we're going to punish those who tried to hide you, Mordechai and your people. So therefore, Mordechai said, don't let them know who you are. If you don't let them know who you are, who your family is, etc., then we will be safe. And it was to protect themselves at this time. Now, she continued to do this even later when that reason wasn't relevant anymore. But at the very beginning, at least, it may have been just to protect her family and her people from punishment for trying to hide her and avoid being drafted. But a third possibility, which is kind of the opposite of the first one, but it's worth mentioning, is that remember, there's not so many women actually being selected to be brought to the palace. Mordechai senses that there's something going on here already. And he certainly realizes this later, once she is chosen to be queen. He tells her, you have to intervene on behalf of the Jewish people. Who knows if this is why you became queen? He senses God's hand here. And it could be already at this time, he realizes there's something more going on. If she's already been chosen to be brought to the palace, the kind of this funny feeling that maybe she's going to actually be chosen to be queen. Now, why that means she should hide her identity. So, because it could be that if Achashverosh knew that she was Jewish, then he wouldn't select her. So this is, again, like the totally opposite approach. Up to now, we've been saying they've been trying to avoid being selected. But others say, at this point, Mordechai realized that maybe she should be selected. Maybe there's something deeper going on here. If it's so many things that fall into place already, that she's been brought to the palace, etc., maybe this is supposed to happen, and we shouldn't get in the way. And so he says, don't tell who you are. If you would tell who you are, if you would know you're Jewish, he's not going to choose you. Could be that God's plan here is that you be selected and you're going to play an important role later. So those are three possibilities. Again, either he wanted to, they didn't want to be selected. So they didn't want Achashverosh to know that she came from royal lineage, or the opposite, they did want to be selected, so they didn't want him to know that she's Jewish, or they just didn't want Achashverosh or the guards to know who her family was, because they might then punish her family or nation or whoever was involved in hiding her. Okay, verse 12. And when each maiden's turn arrived to go to King Achashverosh, after having been treated according to the practice prescribed for the women for 12 months, for so were the days of their ointments completed, 6 months with myrrh oil and 6 months with perfumes and with the ointments of the women. So there's a 12-month preparation period before the maidens are brought to the king, where they receive all sorts of oils and ointments, etc., preparing them for that meeting with the king. The Malbim says that they wanted to see the girls in all seasons to make sure that they, during the winter, they don't get sick, or, that they're strong and that their skin is good, etc. They wanted to see them in all the different seasons. Verse 13, then with this, the maiden would come to the king. Whatever she would request would be given to her to come with her from the house of the women to the king's house. They would give her whatever she would request. And what does that mean? So what that means, according to some commentaries, is that Achashverosh was worried. He's going to bring these women to him. They're going to be brought to him. And if he doesn't like them, he's going to have sexual relations with them. And then he's going to send them off if he doesn't want them. Now, he may have been, this crazy monarch and powerful, but he didn't want people to despise him. So he kind of made a deal with them in a certain way, so that they would be agreeable to be with him. And that was that they could have whatever they want. You can have whatever you want. Whatever she would request would be given to her to come with her from the house of the women to the king's house. Whatever she would want, she could choose, she could have. Beautiful. He would lavish her with gifts. And that was kind of a deal. I'm going to give you the gifts, but you might get sent home and you won't complain because you got all sorts of gifts. It might affect you for the rest of your life, but you'll have gotten the gifts and you won't complain. And that was why they were offered whatever they wanted to. We're going to see that Esther, again, refuses anything. Esther is not willing to come. Esther does not take any gifts in exchange, and she's forced to come, but she at no point agrees to this arrangement. Verse 14, still talking in general about the maidens in general. In the evening, she would go, and in the morning, she would return. So she would spend a night with the king, and she would return to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain. So now it's a different guy in charge of the women after they leave the king. the guard of the concubines, she would no longer come to the king unless the king wanted her, and she was called by name. So some understand this to mean that she wasn't released back into to go home. Some understand she was. Some understand this verse is saying no, she would go to be permanently with the concubines. All of the women that Ahasuerus rejected as his queen, well, he didn't. They were beautiful women. He kept them as concubines. If he would decide that he wanted to come to him, he could summon her, and it was a terrible situation for whoever was not selected here. And as terrible as it was for Esther to be selected, but also it would have been much worse to not be selected and to just be one of the many of the king's concubines. So now we have Esther's turn comes. So verse 15, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Avichail, Mordechai's uncle, who had taken her for a daughter, came to go into the king, she requested nothing. She said, I don't want anything. I'm not agreeing to this. I'm not taking any gifts. And also she only went when it was her turn, meaning she wasn't interested in this. She had to be forced to go. Except what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the guard of the women, would say, and Esther obtained grace in the eyes of all who beheld her. So despite that she didn't ask for anything extra, she just, whatever Haggai did for her, that's what she wore, that's what she makeup and whatever, but she didn't do anything on her own, but yet she obtained grace in the eyes of all who beheld her. The Talmud has an interesting comment here. It says, Rabbi Elazar said, this teaches that she appeared to each and every one as if she were a member of his own nation. How is it that she found favor in everyone's eyes? Everybody thought that she was one of them, that she was from their own nation. And the commentaries explain that this was very significant in her ability to cover up her identity. Again, they knew that she had come from Mordechai's house. So seemingly she's a Jew, right? Why would she not be? She's come from Mordechai's house. But on the other hand, she had this thing about her that everybody just felt that she was one of them. And so that's how she was still able to maintain and cover up her identity as a Jewess, because everybody had that feeling. And she was able to find grace in the eyes of everybody. And now it's her turn to go before the king. So it says, verse 16, so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Teves, in the 7th year of his reign. And the Talmud says it wasn't random that she was taken in the 10th month in Teves, which has just passed for us last month. It's a winter month. So the Talmud comments, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal house in the 10th month. It was by act of divine providence that Esther was taken to Ahasuerus in a cold winter month in which the body takes pleasure in the warmth of another body. Meaning the timing here has helped her, that Ahasuerus appreciated her presence more. It's a cold winter night. It's also a time that the nights are longer. She had more time spent with Ahasuerus, and this helped. Just the way it worked out, the timing was again of divine providence that it helped that she was selected. Now, despite all of her efforts to avoid, to hide and avoid being selected, and even here she doesn't go to the king; she is taken. Right, verse 16 it says, "So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus." All along she's fighting; she doesn't want to go. And in the end, it's verse 17, and the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor before him more than all the maidens, and he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Despite all of that, miraculously, out of all these women in the whole kingdom, Ahasuerus chooses Esther to be his queen. And again, this is obviously one of the key moments. Like we mentioned last week, we have these very obvious that we all know the key moments in the story. Vashti is killed. Esther is chosen. Mordechai saves Ahasuerus's life, and it's so amazing how all of these things just happen to work out all together. But like I said, when we take it a little slowly and we go verse by verse, we see how much more miraculous it is. So what we saw tonight was this miraculous event that Ahasuerus chooses Esther out of all the maidens. But if we understand it in context, it's how everything comes together, and it's totally the opposite of what should have happened naturally. This is someone who was trying to avoid it. They should have been punished for trying to avoid it. They're not punished. She's doing nothing to help herself to be chosen. She does not want to be chosen. And, still, despite that, even though she's doing everything she can to avoid it, and that should minimize the chances completely to almost nothing that she'd be chosen, she's still chosen. And like we saw now, even just the way the timing works out, it's all divine providence of how she ended up being selected as queen. And this is again part of the hidden miracle of Purim, as the story goes on, that Esther is going to play such a pivotal role in saving the Jewish people. Next week we'll finish off this chapter with the story of how Mordechai saves the life of the king, and how that's going to play an important part of the story. And then we'll continue on to chapter 3, God willing. Thank you so much.
It was beautiful.